On August 24, 2023, in Johannesburg, South Africa, something happened that could reshape the global financial system, and most Americans never realized how important it was. On that day, the BRICS alliance announced it was inviting 6 new countries to join: Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Egypt, Iran, Ethiopia, and Argentina. Now, if you live in the United States, you may have heard that news and thought, okay, another trade bloc, another acronym. But what many people didn't realize is how significant that expansion actually was, because it placed roughly 40 to 45% of the global population and more than a third of global economic output into a coalition that is actively working to reduce dependence on the US dollar in international trade. Not necessarily to destroy the dollar overnight, but to gradually build alternatives. And that distinction matters because the global financial system rarely changes suddenly. It usually shifts slowly at first, and then sometimes very quickly. For decades, the US dollar has functioned as the backbone of global trade, meaning countries around the world hold large amounts of dollars in their reserves and use them to settle international transactions. That system gives the United States enormous advantages, including the ability to borrow cheaply and run large deficits because the rest of the world needs dollars to operate the global economy. But that system is beginning to face new pressures. In 1999, the US dollar represented about 71% of global currency reserves. Today, that number is closer to 58%. And if the current trend continues, it could fall below 50% sometime within the next decade. That threshold matters because historically, reserve currencies tend to decline gradually and then reach a tipping point where central banks begin diversifying away more quickly. This doesn't happen overnight, but during periods of major adjustment, purchasing power can fall sharply over just a few years as global demand for a currency weakens. History provides a powerful example.
For more than a century, the British pound was the dominant reserve currency of the world. From roughly 1815 until the end of World War II, global trade revolved around the British financial system. But after 2 devastating world wars weakened Britain's economy, confidence slowly began to shift. In 1945, the pound still held about 87% of global reserves, yet over the next 25 years, its share collapsed to roughly 30%. The decline wasn't smooth. Britain was forced to devalue its currency multiple times in 1947, 1949, and 1967 as global confidence gradually moved elsewhere. Once the shift gained momentum, it became increasingly difficult to stop. Many economists describe reserve currency transitions in stages. First, the dominant country begins borrowing heavily because global demand for its currency makes borrowing easy. The United States today carries more than $36 trillion in national debt, something that would be far harder to sustain without reserve currency status. Second, alternatives begin emerging: new payment systems, currency agreements, gold accumulation, and trade conducted outside the dominant currency. Third comes gradual diversification, where central banks slowly reduce exposure. That appears to be the stage the dollar may be entering today, as its share of reserves declines from 71% toward the high 50s. A fourth stage can occur if confidence shifts more rapidly and reserve holdings drop below symbolic thresholds like 50%. And finally, in some historical cases, currencies lose significant purchasing power as global demand falls. Whether the dollar follows that exact path remains uncertain, but several trends are worth watching closely. Central banks have been accumulating gold at record levels, purchasing around 1,136 tons in 2023, the highest level since the mid-20th century. Countries including China, Russia, and India have steadily increased their gold reserves, signaling a desire to diversify away from dollar-denominated assets. Meanwhile, parts of the global energy market, long dominated by the dollar, are slowly experimenting with other currencies. Saudi Arabia has begun accepting Chinese yuan for some oil sales, and several countries are expanding bilateral currency agreements that allow them to trade without first converting into dollars. China has also reduced its holdings of U.S. Treasury bonds from about $1.3 trillion in 2013 to roughly $760 billion today, reflecting broader diversification trends among foreign central banks. At the same time, alternative payment networks are emerging.
China's CIPS system and new payment initiatives discussed among BRICS nations aim to create infrastructure that allows international trade to settle in multiple currencies rather than relying exclusively on the dollar-based SWIFT network. Another turning point in global financial psychology came in 2022, when roughly $300 billion of Russian central bank reserves were frozen after the invasion of Ukraine. That move was widely supported by Western governments, but it also sent a signal to many countries around the world that foreign reserves held in another country's financial system can become vulnerable during geopolitical conflict. As a result, some governments began reconsidering how much of their wealth should remain concentrated in dollar-denominated assets. None of this means the dollar will suddenly collapse. The United States still has the largest economy in the world, the deepest capital markets, and the most liquid financial system on the planet. Those advantages are enormous and cannot be replicated quickly. But it does suggest that the global monetary system may be entering a long transition toward a more multipolar structure, where several major currencies share influence rather than one dominating everything. If that transition continues, it could have real implications for American households. A weaker dollar would make imported goods more expensive, affecting prices for electronics, vehicles, clothing, and energy. It could also influence interest rates if foreign demand for U.S. government debt declines, potentially raising borrowing costs across the economy. And because retirement accounts, pensions, and savings are largely denominated in dollars, any sustained loss of purchasing power would directly affect long-term financial planning. That's one reason many investors pay close attention to assets that historically preserve value during currency transitions, including gold, silver, and other real assets. Central banks themselves are sending a signal through their gold purchases that diversification matters in uncertain monetary environments. None of these shifts guarantee a specific outcome, but they do suggest the global financial system is evolving. For decades, the U.S. dollar has sat at the center of global trade, finance, and reserves. The question now is not whether that dominance disappears overnight, it almost certainly will not, but whether the world gradually moves toward a system where multiple currencies share that role. And if that transition unfolds over the coming decades, the countries and individuals who understand the change early will be far better positioned than those who assume the current system will remain exactly the same forever.